Book Two, Part Two, of The Republic, by Plato. This recording is in the public domain. Read by Bob Neufeld. Let us consider, first of all, what will be their way of life, now that we have thus established them. Will they not produce corn and wine and clothes and shoes, and build houses for themselves? And when they are housed, they will work in summer commonly stripped and barefoot, but in winter substantially clothed and shod. They will feed on barley meal and flour of wheat, baking and kneading them, making noble cakes and loaves. These they will serve up on a mat of reeds or on clean leaves, themselves reclining the while upon beds strewn with yew or myrtle. And they and their children will feast, drinking the wine which they have made, wearing garlands on their heads, and hymning the praises of the gods in happy converse with one another. And they will take care that their families do not exceed their means, having an eye to poverty or war. But, said Glaucon, interposing, you have not given them a relish to their meal. True, I replied, I had forgotten. Of course they must have a relish, salt and olives and cheese, and they will boil roots and herbs such as country people prepare. For a dessert we shall give them figs and peas and beans, and they will roast myrtle berries and acorns at the fire, drinking in moderation. And with such a diet they may be expected to live in peace and health to a good old age, and bequeath a similar life to their children after them. Yes, Socrates, he said, and if you were providing for a city of pigs, how else would you feed the beasts? But what would you have, Glaucon? I replied. Why, he said, you should give them the ordinary conveniences of life. People who are to be comfortable are accustomed to lie on sofas and dine off tables, and they should have sauces and sweets in the modern style. Yes, I said. Now I understand. The question which you would have me consider is, not only how a state, but how a luxurious state is created, and possibly there is no harm in this, for in such a state we shall be more likely to see how justice and injustice originate. In my opinion, the true and healthy constitution of a state is the one which I have described. But if you wish also to see a state at fever heat, I have no objection. For I suspect that many will not be satisfied with a simpler way of life. They will be for adding sofas and tables and other furniture, also dainties and perfumes and incense and courtesans and cakes, all these not of one sort only, but in every variety. We must go beyond the necessaries of which I was at first speaking, such as houses and clothes and shoes. The arts of the painter and the embroiderer will have to be set in motion, and gold and ivory and all sorts of materials must be procured. True, he said. Then we must enlarge our borders, for the original healthy state is no longer sufficient. Now will the city have to fill and swell with a multitude of callings which are not required by any natural want, such as a whole tribe of hunters and actors, of whom one large class have to do with forms and colours, another will be the votaries of music, poets and their attendant train of rhapsodists, players, dancers, contractors, also makers of divers kinds of articles, including women's dresses, and we shall want more servants. Will not tutors be also in request, and nurses wet and dry, tire women and barbers, as well as confectioners and cooks, and swineherds too, who were not needed, and therefore had no place in the former edition of our state, but are needed now. They must not be forgotten, and there will be animals of many other kinds, if people eat them. Certainly. And living in this way we shall have much greater need of physicians than before. Much greater. And the country which was enough to support the original habitants will be too small now, and not enough. Quite true. Then a slice of our neighbours' land will be wanted by us for pasture and tillage, and they will want a slice of ours, if, like ourselves, they exceed the limit of necessity and give themselves up to the unlimited accumulation of wealth. That, Socrates, will be inevitable. And so we shall go to war, Glaucon. shall we not?" "Most certainly," he replied. "Then, without determining as yet whether war does good or harm, this much we may affirm, that now we have discovered war to be derived from causes which are also the causes of almost all the evils in states, private as well as public. Undoubtedly. And our state must once more enlarge, and this time the enlargement will be nothing short of a whole army, which will have to go out and fight with the invaders for all that we have, as well as for the things and persons whom we were describing above." "Why," he said, "are they not capable of defending themselves?" "No," I said, "not if we were right in the principle which was acknowledged by all of us when we were framing the state. The principle, as you will remember, was that one man cannot practice many arts with success." "Very true," he said. "But is not war an art?" "Certainly, and an art requiring as much attention as shoemaking." "Quite true. And the shoemaker was not allowed by us to be a husbandman, or a weaver, or a builder, in order that we might have our shoes well made. But to him and to every other worker was assigned one work for which he was by nature fitted, and at that he was to continue working all his life long, and at no other. He was not to let opportunities slip, and then he would become a good workman. Now, nothing can be more important than that the work of a soldier should be well done. But is war an art so easily acquired that a man may be a warrior who is also a husbandman, or shoemaker, or other artisan, although no one in the world would be a good dice or draught player who merely took up the game as a recreation, and had not from his earliest years devoted himself to this and nothing else? No tools will make a man a skilled workman, or a master of defence, nor be of any use to him who has not learned how to handle them, and has never bestowed any attention upon them. How then will he who takes up a shield, or other implement of war, become a good fighter all in a day, whether with heavy armed or any other kind of troops? Yes, he said, the tools which would teach men their own use would be beyond price. And the higher the duties of the guardian, I said, the more time and skill and art and application will be needed by him. No doubt, he replied. Will he not also require natural aptitude for his calling? Certainly. Then it will be our duty to select, if we can, natures which are fitted for the task of guarding the city. It will. And the selection will be no easy matter, I said. But we must be brave and do our best. We must. Is not the noble youth very like a well-bred dog in respecting of guarding and watching? What do you mean? I mean that both of them ought to be quick to see and swift to overtake the enemy when they see him, and strong too, if, when they have caught him, they have to fight with him. All these qualities, he replied, will certainly be required by them. Well, and your guardian must be brave if he is to fight well. Certainly. And is he likely to be brave who has no spirit, whether horse or dog or any other animal? Have you never observed how invincible and unconquerable is spirit, and how the presence of it makes the soul of any creature to be absolutely fearless and indomitable? I have. Then now we have a clear notion of the bodily qualities which are required in the guardian. True, and also of the mental ones. His soul is to be full of spirit? Yes. But are not these spirited natures apt to be savage with one another and with everybody else? A difficulty by no means easy to overcome, he replied. Whereas, I said, they ought to be dangerous to their enemies and gentle to their friends. If not, they will destroy themselves without waiting for their enemies to destroy them. True, he said. What is to be done, then? I said. How shall we find a gentle nature which has also a great spirit, for the one is the contradiction of the other? True. He will not be a good guardian who is wanting in either of these two qualities, and yet the combination of them appears to be impossible, and hence we must infer that to be a good guardian is impossible. I am afraid that what you say is true, he replied. Here, feeling perplexed, I began to think over what had preceded. "My friend," I said, "no wonder that we are in a perplexity, for we have lost sight of the image which we had before us." "What do you mean?" he said. "I mean to say that there do exist natures gifted with these opposite qualities." "And where do you find them?" "Many animals," I replied, "furnish examples of them. Our friend the dog is a very good one. You know that well-bred dogs are perfectly gentle to their familiars and acquaintances, and the reverse to strangers." "Yes, I know." "Then there is nothing impossible or out of order of nature in our finding a guardian who has a similar combination of qualities?" "Certainly not." "What? Would not he who is fitted to be a guardian, besides the spirited nature, need to have the qualities of a philosopher?" "I do not apprehend your meaning." "The trait of which I am speaking," I replied, "may also be seen in the dog, and is remarkable in the animal." "What trait?" "Why, a dog, whenever he sees a stranger, is angry. When an acquaintance, he welcomes him, although the one has never done him any harm, nor the other any good. Did this never strike you as curious?" "The matter never struck me before, but I quite recognize the truth of your remark." "And surely this instinct of the dog is very charming. Your dog is a true philosopher." "Why?" "Why, because he distinguishes the face of a friend and of an enemy only by the criterion of knowing and not knowing. And must not an animal be a lover of learning who determines what he likes and dislikes by the test of knowledge and ignorance?" "Most assuredly. And is not the love of learning the love of wisdom, which is philosophy?" "They are the same," he replied. "And may we not say confidently of man also, that he who is likely to be gentle to his friends and acquaintances must by nature be a lover of wisdom and knowledge?" "That we may safely affirm." "Then he who has to be a really good and noble guardian of the state will require to unite in himself philosophy and spirit and swiftness and strength?" "Undoubtedly." "Then we have found the desired natures. And now that we have found them, how are they to be reared and educated? Is not this an inquiry which may be expected to throw light on the greater inquiry which is our final end? How do justice and injustice grow up in states? For we do not want either to omit what is to the point, or to draw out the argument to an inconvenient length. Adeimantus thought that the inquiry would be of great service to us. "Then," I said, "my dear friend, the task must not be given up, even if somewhat long." "Certainly not." "Come, then, and let us pass a leisure hour in story-telling, and our story shall be the education of our heroes." "By all means." "And what shall be their education? Can we find a better than the traditional sort? And this has two divisions, gymnastic for the body, and music for the soul." "True." "Shall we begin education with music, and go on to gymnastics afterwards?" "By all means." "And when you speak of music, do you include literature or not?" "I do." "And literature may be either true or false?" "Yes." "And the young shall be trained in both kinds, and we begin with the false?" "I do not understand your meaning," he said. "You know," I said, "that we begin by telling children stories which, though not wholly destitute of truth, are in the main fictitious, and these stories are told them when they are not of an age to learn gymnastics." "Very true." "That was my meaning when I said that we must teach music before gymnastics." "Quite right," he said. "You know also that the beginning is the most important part of any work, especially in the case of a young and tender thing, for that is the time at which the character is being formed, and the desired impression is more readily taken." "Quite true. And shall we just carelessly allow children to hear any casual tales which may be devised by casual persons, and to receive into their minds ideas for the most part the very opposite of those which we should wish them to have when they are grown up? We cannot." "Then the first thing would be to establish a censorship of the writers of fiction, and let the censors receive any tale of fiction which is good, and reject the bad. and we will desire mothers and nurses to tell their children the authorized ones only. Let them fashion the mind with such tales, even more fondly than they mould the body with their hands, but most of those which are now in use must be discarded. Of what tales are you speaking? He said. You may find a model of the lesser in the greater, I said, for they are necessarily of the same type, and there is the same spirit in both of them. Very likely, he replied, but I do not as yet know what you would term the greater. Those, I said, which are narrated by Homer and Hesiod, and the rest of the poets, which have ever been the great story-tellers of mankind. But which stories do you mean? He said, and what fault do you find with them? A fault which is most serious, I said, the fault of telling a lie, and what is more, a bad lie. But when is this fault committed? Whenever an erroneous representation is made of the nature of gods and heroes, as when a painter paints a portrait not having the shadow of a likeness to the original. Yes, he said, that sort of thing is certainly very blamable. But what are the stories which you mean? Well, first of all, I said, there was that greatest of all lies in high places which the poet told to Uranus, which was a bad lie too. I mean what Hesiod says that Uranus did, and how Cronus retaliated on him. The doings of Cronus and the sufferings which in turn his son inflicted upon him, even if they were true, ought certainly not to be lightly told to young and thoughtless persons. If possible, they had better be buried in silence. But if there is an absolute necessity for their mention, a chosen few might hear them in a mystery, and they should sacrifice not a common pig, but some huge and unprocurable victim, and then the numbers of the hearers will be very few indeed. Why, yes, said he, those stories are extremely objectionable. Yes, Adeimantus, they are stories not to be repeated in our state. The young man should not be told that in committing the worst of crimes he is far from doing anything outrageous, and that even if he chastises his father when he does wrong, in whatever manner, he will only be following the example of the first and greatest among the gods. I certainly agree with you, he said. In my opinion, those stories are quite unfit to be repeated. Neither, if we mean our future guardians to regard their habit of quarrelling among themselves as of all things the basest, should any word be said to them of the wars in heaven, and of the plots and fightings of the gods against one another, for they are not true. No, we shall never mention the battles of the giants, or let them be embroidered on garments, and we shall be silent about the innumerable other quarrels of gods and heroes with their friends and relatives. If they would only believe us, we would tell them that quarrelling is unholy, and that never up to this time has there been any quarrel between citizens. This is what old men and old women should begin by telling children, and when they grow up, the poets also should be told to compose for them in the similar spirit. But the narrative of Hephaestus binding here his mother, or how on another occasion Zeus sent him flying for taking her part when she was being beaten, and all the battles of the gods in Homer, these tales must not be admitted into our state, whether they are supposed to have an allegorical meaning or not. For a young person cannot judge what is allegorical and what is literal. Anything that he receives into his mind at that age is likely to become indelible and unalterable. And therefore it is most important that the tales which the young first hear should be models of virtuous thoughts. There you are right, he replied. But if any one asks where are such models to be found, and of what tales are you speaking, how shall you answer him? I said to him, you and I, Adeimantus, at this point are not poets, but founders of a state. Now, the founders of a state ought to know the general forms in which poets should cast their tales, and the limits which must be observed by them, but to make the tales is not their business. Very true, he said. But what are these forms of theology which you mean? Something of this kind, I replied. God is always to be represented as he truly is, whatever be the sort of poetry, epic, lyric, or tragic, in which the representation is given. Right. And is he not truly good, and must he not be represented as such? Certainly. And no good thing is hurtful? No, indeed. And that which is not hurtful hurts not? Certainly not. And that which hurts not does no evil? No. And can that which does no evil be a cause of evil? Impossible. And the good is advantageous? Yes. And therefore the cause of well-being? Yes. It follows, therefore, that the good is not the cause of all things, but of the good only? Assuredly. Then God, if he be good, is not the author of all things, as the many assert, but he is the cause of a few things only, and not of most things that occur to men. For few are the goods of human life, and many are the evils, and the good is to be attributed to God alone. Of the evils, the causes are to be sought elsewhere, and not in him. That appears to me to be most true, he said. Then we must not listen to Homer or to any other poet who is guilty of the folly of saying that two casks lie at the threshold of Zeus, full of lots, one of good, the other of evil lots, and that he to whom Zeus gives a mixture of the two sometimes meets with ill fortune, at other times with good. But to whom is given the cup of unmingled ill, him wild hunger drives o'er the beauteous earth. And again, Zeus, who is the dispenser of good and evil to us. And if any one asserts that the violation of oaths and treaties, which was really the work of Pandarus, was brought about by Athene and Zeus, or that the strife and contention of the gods was instigated by Themis and Zeus, he shall not have our approval. Neither will we allow our young men to hear the words of Aeschylus, that God plants guilt among men when he desires utterly to destroy a house. And if a poet writes of the sufferings of Niobe, the subject of the tragedy in which these iambic verses occur, or of the house of Pelops, or of the Trojan War, or any similar theme, either we must not permit him to say that these are not the works of God, or if they are God, he must devise some explanation of them such as we are seeking. He must say that God did what was just and right, and they were the better for being punished. But that those who are punished are miserable, and that God is the author of their misery, the poet is not to be permitted to say, though he may say that the wicked are miserable because they require to be punished, and are benefited by receiving punishment from God. But that God, being good, is the author of evil to any one is to be strenuously denied, and not to be said or sung or heard in verse or prose by any one, whether old or young, in any well-ordered commonwealth. Such a fiction is suicidal, ruinous, impious. I agree with you, he replied, and am ready to give my assent to the law. Let this, then, be one of our rules and principles concerning the gods, to which our poets and reciters will be expected to conform, that God is not the author of all things, but of good only. That will do, he said. And what do you think of a second principle? Shall I ask you whether God is a magician, and of a nature to appear insidiously now in one shape and now in another, sometimes himself changing and passing into many forms, sometimes deceiving us with the semblance of such transformations? Or is he one and the same, immutably fixed in his own proper image? I cannot answer you, he said, without more thought. Well, I said, but if we suppose a change in anything, that change must be effected either by the thing itself or by some other thing? Most certainly. And things which are at their best are also least liable to be altered or discomposed. For example, when healthiest and strongest, the human frame is least liable to be affected by meats and drinks, and the plant, which is in the fullest vigor, also suffers least from winds, or the heat of the sun, or any similar causes. Of course. And will not the bravest and wisest soul be least confused or deranged by any external influence? True. And the same principle, as I should suppose, applies to all composite things, furniture, houses, garments. When good and well made, they are least altered by time and circumstances. Very true. then everything which is good, whether made by art or nature, or both, is least liable to suffer change from without. True. But surely God and the things of God are in every way perfect. Of course they are. Then he can hardly be compelled by external influence to take many shapes. He cannot. But may he not change and transform himself? Clearly, he said, that must be the case if he is changed at all. And will he then change himself for the better and the fairer, or for the worse and more unsightly? If he change at all, he can only change for the worse, for we cannot suppose him to be deficient either in virtue or beauty. Very true, Adeimantus. But then would any one, whether god or man, desire to make himself worse? Impossible. Then it is impossible that God should ever be willing to change, being, as is supposed, the fairest and best that is conceivable. Every god remains absolutely and forever in his own form. That necessarily follows, he said, in my judgment. Then, I said, my dear friend, let none of the poets tell us that the gods, taking the disguise of strangers from other lands, walk up and down cities in all sorts of forms. And let no one slander Proteus and Thetis. Neither let any one, either in tragedy or in any other kind of poetry, introduce Hera disguised in the likeness of a priestess asking an alms for the life-giving daughters of Inachus, the river of Argus. Let us have no more lies of that sort. Neither must we have mothers under the influence of the poets scaring their children with a bad version of these myths, telling how certain gods, as they say, go about by night in the likeness of so many strangers and in divers forms. But let them take heed, lest they make cowards of their children, and at the same time speak blasphemy against the gods. Heaven forbid, he said. But although the gods are themselves unchangeable, still by witchcraft and deception they may make us think that they appear in various forms. Perhaps, he replied. Well, but can you imagine that God will be willing to lie, whether in word or deed, or put forth a phantom of himself? I cannot say, he replied. Do you not know, I said, that the true lie, if such an expression may be allowed, is hated of gods and men? What do you mean? He said. I mean that no one is willingly deceived in that which is the truest and highest part of himself, or about the truest and highest matters. There, above all, he is most afraid of a lie having possession of him. Still, he said, I do not comprehend you. The reason is, I replied, that you attribute some profound meaning to my words, but I am only saying that deception, or being deceived or uninformed about the highest realities in the highest part of themselves, which is the soul, and in that part of them to have and to hold the lie, is what mankind least like. That, I say, is what they utterly detest. There is nothing more hateful to them. And as I was just now remarking, this ignorance in the soul of him who is deceived may be called the true lie, for the lie in words is only a kind of imitation and shadowy image of a previous affection of the soul, not pure unadulterated falsehood. Am I not right? Perfectly right. The true lie is hated not only by the gods, but also by men? Yes. Whereas the lie in words is in certain cases useful and not hateful. In dealing with enemies, that would be an instance. Or again, when those whom we call our friends in a fit of madness or illusion are going to do some harm, then it is useful, and is a sort of medicine or preventive. Also in the tales of mythology, of which we were just now speaking, because we do not know the truth about ancient times, we make falsehood as much like truth as we can, and so turn it into account. Very true, he said. But can any of these reasons apply to God? Can we suppose that he is ignorant of antiquity, and therefore has recourse to invention? That would be ridiculous, he said. Then the lying poet has no place in our idea of God? I should say not. Or perhaps he may tell a lie because he is afraid of enemies. That is inconceivable. But he may have friends who are senseless or mad. But no mad or senseless person can be a friend of God. Then no motive can be imagined why God should lie. None whatever. Then the superhuman and divine is absolutely incapable of falsehood? Yes. Then is God perfectly simple and true, both in word and deed. He changes not. He deceives not, either by sign or word, by dream or waking vision. Your thoughts, he said, are the reflection of my own. You agree with me, then, I said, that this is the second type or form in which we should write and speak about divine things. The gods are not magicians who transform themselves, neither do they deceive mankind in any way. I grant that. Then, although we are admirers of Homer, we do not admire the lying dream which Zeus sends to Agamemnon, neither will we praise the verses of Aeschylus, in which Thetis says that Apollo, at her nuptials, was celebrating in song fair progeny whose days were to be long and to know no sickness. And when he had spoken of my lot as in all things blessed of heaven, he raised a note of triumph and cheered my soul. And I thought that the word of Phoebus, being driven and full of prophecy, would not fail. And now he himself who uttered the strain, he who was present at the banquet, and who said this, he it is who has slain my son. These are the kind of sentiments about the gods which will arouse our anger, and he who utters them shall be refused a chorus, neither shall we allow teachers to make use of them in the instruction of the young, meaning, as we do, that our guardians, as far as men can be, should be true worshippers of the gods, and like them. I entirely agree, he said, in these principles, and promise to make them my laws. End of Part 2.